Introducing myself. My name is Jessica Miller. I'm 17 years old, and I grew up in the small, rainy town of Ashland, Oregon. If you ever visit, you'll find it nestled among pine-covered hills, where the mornings always seem to be shrouded in gray mist, and the air smells faintly of wet earth and fir needles. To most people, it's a quiet, almost picturesque corner of America. Somewhere you'd imagine families living in perfect harmony, sharing homemade blueberry pies and laughter around the dinner table. But life doesn't always match the postcard. The truth is, my story isn't neat or sweet, and it doesn't fit anyone's ideas of the American dream. I'm an only child by birth, raised at first by two parents who, at least to my childhood mind, seemed unbreakable. My father, David Miller, is an engineer, careful, precise, and endlessly patient with machines, if not always with people. My mother, whose name I find hard to say out loud these days, was a school librarian, kind and gentle, with a laugh that used to fill up every room in the house. But when I turned 12, everything fell apart. There were late-night arguments and long silences at breakfast. One morning, my father packed his suitcase, and my mother's eyes were red from crying. I remember thinking it was impossible for families to simply unravel, and yet mine did. Soon after, my father moved into a new apartment, and I found myself bouncing between two homes, neither of which felt truly mine. By the time I turned 15, Dad introduced me to Linda. She was charming in public, silver blonde hair, perfect teeth, sharp green eyes that missed nothing. But there was a chill in her smile, even on that first awkward dinner together. When they married, my world shifted a second time. Linda didn't come alone. She brought along her two children, Cole, who was just a year older than me, and Ashley, who trailed me by a few months. Suddenly, I wasn't an only child anymore, but the outsider in a half-formed family. People sometimes ask what it's like to be a stepkid, and there's never an easy answer. It's not the stuff of fairy tales, that's for sure. While my friends at school imagined sleepovers and shared secrets with their step-siblings, my reality was quieter, lonelier. I was the girl invited into someone else's story, always trying to find a place at the table where the conversation never included me. I'm not telling this for sympathy. Instead, I want to explain how these experiences shaped me. Growing up, I learned to watch and listen carefully, to look for patterns where others saw only chaos. I became, in some ways, invisible, a silent observer in my own life, always picking up on what wasn't being said. It taught me resilience and fueled my determination to carve out a space of my own, no matter how unwelcome I might have felt. This is my story, not just about surviving, but about refusing to let bitterness define me. And maybe, somewhere along the way, showing that even the loneliest voices can find a way to be heard. My new family, in the early days, moving in with Dad and his new family, was nothing like the stories people tell about instant togetherness. By the time I stood in front of Linda's pale blue house, a house that would never really feel like home, I'd become an expert at packing my life into boxes. I remember watching my dad carry my suitcases up the front steps, his face drawn and hopeful, while Linda hovered in the doorway, her lips pulled into a tight smile. Despite the cheerful wreath on the porch and the fresh cookies she set out that first day, the air in that house felt cold. Cole and Ashley were already there, unpacking their own things in the rooms that had always been theirs. They glanced at me with polite disinterest, the sort you might have for a distant cousin visiting for the holidays. Cole, tall and athletic with messy brown hair, barely looked up from his phone, while Ashley, quietly intense with her notebooks and colored pens, offered a brief nod, before disappearing into her world. In that moment, I realized I was the outsider, the new piece forced into a puzzle that had already been assembled. Those first weeks were awkward at best, excruciating at worst. Every minor detail seemed to highlight how much I didn't belong. There were family routines I wasn't part of. Friday night pizza, inside jokes about old vacations, the way everyone automatically knew who sat where at the dinner table. Linda cooked meals that brought smiles to her kids' faces, but she never once asked about my favorite dish. I learned to fill my plate quietly and offer thanks a little too formally, trying not to trip over the silence when conversation flowed around me, but never to me. At school, things weren't much better. People whispered about my new family, and teachers asked if I was settling in, their voices a little too gentle. Cole and Ashley pretended not to know me in the hallway. In class, when group projects were assigned, I was left scanning the room while my step-siblings had their friends already picked. The sense of isolation grew heavier with each passing day, a quiet ache that settled in my chest. At home, Linda maintained a veneer of friendliness, but beneath it was a distance, subtle but unmistakable. She asked about my homework, reminded me of chores, and reminded me to respect house rules. But her affection for Cole and Ashley could not be missed. She laughed a little louder when they spoke, showed genuine care for their problems, and offered small indulgences never extended in my direction. Evenings in my new room, once a sewing room, faintly scented with lavender and mothballs, I'd listen to the laughter drifting from the living room, pressing my ear to the wall just to feel a part of it. Sometimes, I would text my mom late into the night, wishing I could return to a time that felt safe, even if imperfect. But I knew there was no going back. Looking back, those early days taught me two things: how to disappear in plain sight, and how loneliness can make you sharper, more watchful. I started to see every glance and gesture in that house as clues, as if learning the secrets to fitting in might offer a way to break through the invisible wall. Little did I know, surviving those days would give me the resolve I'd need for the battles yet to come. Unfair treatment. Living in Linda's house meant learning a whole new way to measure time, not by days or seasons, but by the small, almost invisible cuts that built up inside me, each one a reminder that I simply didn't belong. If the first weeks were awkward, the months that followed became a kind of slow-burning endurance test. At first, I tried to convince myself I was just being sensitive. After all, blended families take time, people always said. But in my case, no amount of patience or optimism could soften the edges of Linda's indifference or buffer me against the subtle, ruthless alliances that formed around me. From the outside, most people wouldn't have noticed. Linda was skilled at performing just enough kindness to maintain her image as a thoughtful stepmom. She baked cookies for the school bake sale, drove us to soccer games, and posted bright, filtered photos on Facebook that made it look like some sitcom version of family. But at home, behind doors that were shut just a little too quietly, the truth played out in 100 ways. It was the little things, first. The house was full of unwritten rules, most of which I only learned by breaking them. Cole and Ashley had shelves for their shoes near the door. Mine were relegated to a plastic tray in the laundry room. They had hooks for their backpacks near the stairs, each labeled with their names in bubbly cursive. My name never appeared in the hallway. A small thing, but a clear message about who belonged. I told myself it didn't matter. You can't expect the world to rearrange itself just for you. But part of me was still searching for some sign. Any sign. that I was wanted. After dinner, everyone had chores. Cole cleared the table. Ashley helped load the dishwasher. I scrubbed pots and pans and wiped the counters, then swept the kitchen floors, alone. If I missed a spot or left a smudge, Linda pointed it out with a sigh, adding, "You need to try a little harder to be part of this family." The words slid into me like ice water. Sometimes she'd compliment Cole for helping, or give Ashley a snack while she did her chores. For me, there were only reminders and corrections. School brought its own set of complications. During orientation for the new semester, both Cole and Ashley already had inside tracks, old friends, favorite teachers, and a mother who did PTO volunteer work. My schedule was a hodgepodge of leftover electives. I ended up in classes I didn't ask for, with no familiar faces. I tried, at first, to reach out. I joined the yearbook club, something I'd loved back at my old school, but the faculty advisor was Linda's neighbor and gave sly, backhanded encouragement. "You're David's daughter, right? Good luck keeping up with Cole and Ashley. They're naturals." Funny thing was, neither of them cared for yearbook, but their reputation preceded me, closing doors before I could even knock on them. It wasn't just clubs. Scholarships, summer camp applications, and even basic school supplies somehow became battles I could never win. I still remember the day the guidance counselor congratulated Ashley for winning a regional writing award, an opportunity I hadn't even known was available because Linda had accidentally left the information at the bottom of a mail pile I rarely saw. When I brought it up, Linda's shrug was dismissive. "You know, some things just slip through the cracks when you're busy." She never once apologized, and Ashley never once offered to share credit, not even when several of the lines in her essay sounded suspiciously like the ones I'd written in my own journal and left on my desk. The difference in how we were treated was impossible to ignore. Cole and Ashley were showered with small luxuries and daily privileges that never reached my hands. Sometimes it was as trivial as the last Pop-Tart in the box, which Ashley always seemed to get, or extra money slipped into Cole's jacket before a class trip. Sometimes it was bigger birthday parties, better gifts, more freedom. My 16th birthday was celebrated with a store-bought cake, a hastily wrapped sweater, and a text message from Linda saying, "Hope you enjoy your day." In contrast, Cole's 17th was a weekend-long affair, with a barbecue, decorations, and the whole family gathering, as if it were a national holiday. Looking back, the house itself felt like a minefield, laced with small signals of what was allowed and what wasn't. Linda's rules were clear when it came to her kids. They were allowed to have friends over, take snacks from the kitchen at will, and leave their shoes anywhere. I was reprimanded for having a friend drop by unannounced. "This isn't a hotel, Jessica," Linda would remind me. Or for leaving a jacket on the living room chair. "Put that away. We try to keep things organized here." Her words were always laced with implication. Everything you touch is disorder, disruption. There were bigger things, too. Real opportunities and moments that stung in ways I struggled to admit, even to myself. Take, for example, the honors math program I'd dreamed of joining. My math teacher approached me after class, one afternoon, to ask why I hadn't applied. He said I was more than qualified. Confused, I went home and checked the email Linda managed for all school notifications. I found the email about the honors application, unopened and unread. When I confronted Linda, cautiously, trying to keep my tone neutral, she simply blinked and said, "Oh, I thought you'd be too busy adjusting." Besides, Cole expressed interest, and they only had limited spots. Cole's grades in math were average at best, but somehow He got in while I got left behind. It didn't end there. As the months passed, I noticed a pattern. Every scholarship, every club, every after-school program seemed to go to Cole and Ashley. Sometimes, applications mysteriously went missing after I filled them out. Other times, Linda would claim that deadlines had passed, only for me to learn from classmates that they had another week. Even when I brought it up with Dad, he'd get defensive, saying, "Linda's just trying to keep things fair. You need to adjust." It hurt more than I wanted to admit. The emotional toll was enormous. I spent most evenings in my room, fighting the urge to cry, or yell, or break something. My friendships at my old school faded, and the friends I tried to make here were always orbiting around Cole or Ashley's circles. At night, I could hear laughter from downstairs. Linda's voice, warm and rich, Ashley's bright giggle, Cole's teasing. I'd press my headphones tighter and disappear into books, wishing, just once, somebody would miss me if I slipped away. Maybe the worst part was how invisible I became to myself. Little by little, I stopped offering opinions, stopped cracking jokes, stopped showing up to watch TV or help with dinner. I went out of my way to be polite, quiet, undemanding, a ghost with no footprints in a house built for others. On the rare occasions when Dad and I were alone, I'd catch flickers of the old closeness between us, a hint of the bond we used to share. But even he seemed wary, as if my sadness was something contagious that might infect the uneasy peace of his new marriage. Linda, for her part, never missed a chance to remind me how grateful I should be. "You know, not every girl your age gets a room of her own and new clothes for school," she'd point out, her voice always just sharp enough to hurt. What she didn't say was that the room had been a sewing closet, still smelling faintly of mothballs, and the clothes were whatever Ashley didn't want anymore. One Thanksgiving, during a rare dinner with all of us at the table, Linda went around saying what she appreciated about each kid. "Ashley, your creativity lights up every day. Cole, your hard work and drive inspire me." When she got to me, she simply said, "Jessica, you do a good job of keeping things tidy." The conversation moved on, and so did my hope for anything more. Of course, it wasn't just Linda. Cole and Ashley may not have been outwardly cruel most of the time, but their alliance was airtight. At school, they acted as if I was invisible. In the crowded cafeteria, there was never a seat for me at their table. If I joined a club or tried out for a team, Ashley's friends rolled their eyes and made excuses to leave. Cole would occasionally offer a curt nod, a flicker of recognition, but never invited me into his world the way siblings sometimes do. If I tried to bridge the gap, offering to help Ashley study or suggesting we walk home together, she would say she was busy, only to spend the afternoon laughing with her friends in the park across the street. The holidays were particularly sharp. On Christmas morning, Cole and Ashley would rush down the stairs to stockings bursting at the seams and gifts piled high. My presents, unwrapped and labeled with my name in Linda's precise handwriting, were neatly placed off to one side. When I opened them, Linda watched closely, as if grading my reactions. The gifts were always practical: socks, notebooks, a pack of pens. Nothing personal, nothing thoughtful. Meanwhile, Cole unwrapped a new game console and Ashley squealed over a custom art set. Even my dad seemed oblivious to the difference, hugging me briefly and moving on. No matter how hard I tried, nothing seemed to shift the balance. If I excelled at something, Linda would find a way to minimize it. When I brought home straight A's, she said, "We all know you're smart, Jessica. Just don't let it go to your head." If I dropped a plate, it was a crisis. if Cole left his dirty laundry everywhere. Linda laughed, ruffled his hair, and called him her little tornado. Even tiny mistakes became ammunition. Once, when a jar of jelly slipped from my hands and shattered, Linda spent the afternoon retelling the story to her friends. How Jessica means well, but she's just not used to being responsible yet. Over time, I learned that the best way to avoid trouble was to become invisible. I did my chores early, quietly. I stayed out of sight in the evenings, spent weekends walking alone or hiding out at the library. I let my opinions die before reaching my lips. When Ashley borrowed my favorite book and returned it water-damaged, Linda shrugged off my complaint. "Oh, it's just a book. Don't be so dramatic." But when I accidentally misplaced one of Ashley's sketch pads, it turned into a full-scale investigation until I found it, apologizing over and over again. Sometimes I wondered if I was overreacting, reading too much into every glance and word. But the cumulative weight was real. 1,000 paper cuts that changed how I saw myself and the world around me. Linda's quiet favoritism taught me to be wary, to doubt kindness, to expect disappointment. It carved away pieces of my confidence until I almost forgot what it felt like to stand up straight. I started to keep a record, tiny notes in my phone, or scribbled in the margins of my homework. I wrote down every slight, every so-called accident, every time I was blamed for something I didn't do. It didn't make things easier, but it gave me a sense of order, a way to prove, if only to myself, that I wasn't imagining things. Each note was a small act of resistance, a refusal to let their narrative erase me. My dad was the one variable I couldn't predict. Sometimes he stuck up for me, a stern word to Linda when he thought she was being hard on me, a quietly shared joke when nobody else was around. But more often than not, he seemed tired, pulled taut between his new wife and his only child. Slowly, I watched him pull away, the way someone learning to swim pushes off from the side of the pool. I missed him fiercely, but I was learning not to need anyone. If there was one thing all that unfairness taught me, it was how to survive, even when surviving meant shrinking down, learning everything about their world while revealing nothing about my own. I watched and listened and waited, and as the months wore on, I began to wonder if there might be power in knowing more than I let on, a kind of quiet advantage in seeing what others tried so hard to hide. But even then, I never stopped hoping that one day someone would open a door for me, not out of obligation, but out of kindness. Until then, all I could do was keep moving, keep learning, and never let myself forget who I was before I became invisible. The turning point, if there's a single moment that splits my story in two, before and after, it happened during the Christmas I turned 16. It wasn't marked by yelling or shattered plates, nothing loud enough to startle the neighbors. No, what changed everything for me happened quietly, like the slow drip of water carving a canyon into stone, one drop at a time, until finally something gives way and the earth splits open. Up until that holiday season, I'd learned to survive in Linda's house by shrinking myself, by staying quiet and invisible, or at least less visible than her cherished Cole and Ashley. I lived in the spaces between everyone else's routines, always in the kitchen first to do my chores, last to leave the table so I could wipe away crumbs missed by others, careful to thank Linda for every meal, even when my plate looked nothing like my step-siblings. I tiptoed around their lives, careful not to leave fingerprints. But as Christmas approached that year, I felt an ache I couldn't quite name, something colder and more final than ordinary loneliness. Maybe it was because it was the first Christmas I wasn't spending the night before in my mom's living room, decorating sugar cookies with her while old jazz played softly under the flash of colorful string lights. Maybe it was the way Dad seemed exhausted all the time, defeated, before I could even get up the nerve to ask if he wanted to help hang ornaments, like we used to. Linda, of course, was in her element. She decked out the house in magazine-worthy decorations. Silver garlands, pillars of twinkling lights, a towering fresh tree with all the good ornaments clustered on the front, and shiner-than-life, presents piling up underneath. She sent out Christmas cards, posed pictures of our blended family, in which my smile is a little too tight, my hand resting awkwardly on Cole's shoulder. But nobody else seemed to notice. In every snapshot, we looked like someone else's dream family. A week before Christmas, Linda announced she'd handle the Christmas shopping for everyone's convenience. And Dad, drained from year-end work, just nodded his agreement. Still, I tried to hold on to hope. This year, I told myself, maybe things would be different. I dropped hints about wanting a pair of headphones, used even, so I could tune out the world and do homework in peace. I invited Linda on quick trips to the store, tried offering recipes for cookies my mom and I used to bake, even pitched in extra hard with cleaning and decorating, hoping she'd notice. She didn't. The gift of absence. On Christmas Eve, the house took on a nervous energy. Cole and Ashley were giddy. They already knew they'd gotten what they wanted. Video games for him. Professional art supplies for her. I watched them giggle and strategize in the living room, pulling labeled packages from under the tree to shake and poke at their wrapping. Linda watched them with pride, eyes full of warmth, directing a few distracted questions my way. "All done with your chores, Jessica," before turning back to her own children. That evening, Dad tried to coax everyone into the living room for a movie. Linda begged off, saying she needed to wrap just a few more gifts. Cole and Ashley retreated to their rooms with their phones. I sat next to Dad for a while, but as soon as the movie started and he dozed off, I realized I was by myself, bathed in the flicker of a TV I barely heard. Somehow, the distance between us all felt wider than it ever had before. Unable to sleep, I wandered into the kitchen late that night, drawn by the smell of pine and the hush of snow falling outside. There, on the table, I noticed a folder, one of Linda's, the kind she used to organize bills and family paperwork. It was gaping open, as if someone had hurriedly tossed it down. Inside, I glimpsed a letter with Miller Family Tuition Account, printed at the top. I recognized the name. My dad set up the account years ago, after my parents' divorce, promising it would cover my future college expenses, no matter what happened in his new marriage. At first, I only meant to peek, to satisfy my curiosity. But as I read, fear froze my hands. The balance on the account was shockingly low, almost nothing left. Confused, I kept paging through statements and receipts. My heart thudded against my ribs as I realized what I was seeing. Large, regular payments made out to the private schools Cole and Ashley attended, schools Linda insisted gave them an edge. Their tuition, fully covered, from my dad's account, from the money meant for me. The folder rattled in my fingers as I put it back, shame and fury burning my face. I slipped upstairs, heart pounding so loudly I was sure someone would hear. But the house was dark and silent. My secret safe, at least for now. The fallout. On Christmas morning, I played along. I opened my gifts, socks, a day planner, a plain blue sweater, all labeled with my name in the same sharp script Linda used for groceries and school forms. Cole shrieked over a new console. Ashley wept with joy at her art set. Linda filmed everything on her phone, narrating the festivities for her distant relatives and online friends. Dad hugged me, brief and distracted, and thanked me for being so mature. I almost laughed, thinking of the folder in the kitchen, the tuition payments draining away what little he'd saved for the promises he made to me. I kept his secret from him all morning, unsure if I felt more betrayed by Linda's actions or by his obliviousness. Later that day, I tried to ask him about the account, carefully, quietly, while Linda was in the kitchen and everyone else was out of earshot. He brushed it off, saying, "I trust Linda to take care of that stuff. She knows what the kids need." When I pushed harder, he got annoyed, accused me of being ungrateful, told me not to ruin the holiday with drama. I knew then that I was truly alone in that house. Quiet rage. I didn't scream. I didn't break down. Instead, a strange coldness settled over me, a sharp clarity, like looking out a window after a storm. I spent the afternoon replaying every small slight and favor denied, every correction and reprimand. I saw with new eyes Linda's carefully orchestrated world, where I was always a burden, always too much, never part of the inner circle. I thought of all the lost opportunities, the clubs I was shut out of, the applications that never made it into my hands. Cole and Ashley reaped all the benefits, rarely noticing what was taken from me. That night, in the privacy of my small lavender-scented room, I cried until my throat was raw. I wasn't just sad anymore. I was furious. I thought about calling my mom, but how could I explain this? How could I make her understand the 1,000 ways I'd slowly disappeared, erased bit by bit? Instead, I did something I'd never done before. I opened my laptop and began making a list, a document titled simply, Proof. I wrote down everything: the tuition account, the missing applications, the way Linda always intercepted school emails. I added screenshots of texts, photos of my measly Christmas gifts lined up next to the ones overflowing from Cole and Ashley's pile. The more I wrote, the less alone I felt. I was building something. Evidence, a story, maybe even a way out. The days after, the days following Christmas break, were colder than I can ever remember. Outside, snow kept falling, trapping us inside together. Inside, the air felt razor thin. Linda was smugly triumphant, her children content, her household photo-ready. Cole and Ashley basked in their usual privileges. Dad kept mostly to himself, venturing out only to commiserate with Linda about work or finances, oblivious to how drastically the world had shifted for me. If Linda noticed my silence, she ignored it. If Dad noticed, he pretended not to. Each morning, I did my chores with precision, holding my tongue when Linda corrected me. Each afternoon, I avoided Cole and Ashley's paths, refusing invitations I knew were insincere. Every night, I added to my document, gathering proof with the careful patience of someone untangling a knot. It amazed me how invisible I could become, even while living in the center of other people's lives. At dinner, I watched as Linda lavished praise on her kids, barely acknowledging me unless she needed something done. At school, I watched as Ashley received another award based on work I'd helped her finish, as Cole got extra help with his classes that I'd once begged for and been denied. Each small unfairness, once simply painful, was now a data point. I stopped hoping for things to change. Instead, I planned internal change. The most surprising part of all was how calm I started to feel. Before, I'd struggled to keep my chin up, desperate for acknowledgement or a kind word. Now, it all felt like background noise, as if, having finally seen the truth, I could no longer be hurt by their indifference. I started setting boundaries. I stopped offering to do extra chores, started spending weekends at the public library, started refusing to answer questions about my day unless asked directly. When Linda made a snide remark, I logged it mentally, filing it away for a future I had started to imagine, one where I would finally be heard. Sometimes at night, lying awake in the dark, I would replay the moment I found the tuition statement. The betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about trust, about the years of small sacrifices I'd accepted, all revealed as a lie. I became determined not to let Linda control my story any longer. A new kind of strength. If anyone had asked what changed that Christmas, I wouldn't have been able to answer right away. On the outside, I was still the same. Quiet, straight A student, reliable Jessica. But inside, something had shifted. I no longer felt powerless. Every day I watched more closely, listened more carefully, and documented everything. I researched state laws around guardianship and college accounts, reading late into the night under my blanket. I talked to guidance counselors and began subtly asking questions about scholarship deadlines, club signups, and application processes, making sure Linda wouldn't have another chance to block my way. I even started to study Linda, not as the villain in my story, but as an opponent in a strategic game. Every morning she set a different trap, commenting on my posture, my makeup, my study habits. But I learned to answer with perfect politeness and nothing more, denying her the conflict she seemed to crave. I paid attention to who visited the house, to which neighbors Linda gossiped with, to which teachers she cultivated. The more I noticed, the more obvious her patterns became. Charm in public, coldness at home, control over every resource that might be mine. Cole and Ashley sensed a change, too. Ashley grew more suspicious when I didn't react to her barbs, more competitive as her mother subtly shifted the pressure onto her. Cole, never one for subtlety, seemed relieved that I no longer tried to talk with him. The alliances in the house grew tighter, more defensive, as if they realized, without saying it, that they could no longer count on me to stay quiet. Acceptance and resolve. The biggest transformation, though, was in how I saw myself. For years, I had let myself believe that life happened to me, that the best I could do was endure and hope for scraps. But standing at the edge of 16, with snow piled on the windowsill and a folder of evidence tucked away in my laptop, I realized that I could do more than endure. I could fight back in my own careful way. The Christmas of my 16th year marked the end of my life as a silent observer. It was the start of something fierce and new, the moment I understood that survival sometimes means refusing to accept the story written for you. It was a turning point, not just for my relationship with Linda and the rest of the family, but for the girl I saw in the mirror every morning. No longer invisible, no longer voiceless, but quietly gathering her power, waiting for the right moment to step forward. Everything that followed, the choices, the revelations, the confrontation I was already planning, grew from that one silent night, and from the knowledge that I was done letting my future slip away into someone else's hands. If Linda's house had tried to erase me, it had only succeeded in shaping me into someone determined to reclaim my own story. Quiet plans. After that Christmas, everything about the way I approached life in Linda's house changed. Outwardly, I probably looked the same to anyone watching. A withdrawn teenager who kept to herself, studious, quiet, almost invisible unless someone needed kitchen counters scrubbed or homework printed. But internally, something had snapped, or maybe finally solidified. Like clay fired in an oven, I was done being the subject of someone else's story. If I couldn't change my situation right away, then at least I could control how I responded. I decided I would become not just a survivor, but but a strategist. I realized the only way to protect myself was knowledge. Meticulous, undeniable, documented knowledge. I didn't want vengeance, exactly. What I wanted was sunlight. To shine a harsh, clean light on everything Linda and her kids wanted to hide, and to reclaim whatever scraps of power I had left. Observation mode. My first step was simple. Pay attention. In the past, my watchfulness had been about survival, knowing when to disappear, when to choke back a joke, when to make myself smaller. Now I sharpened those instincts and turned them outward, collecting data the way a scientist might monitor a dangerous ecosystem. I became hyper-aware of how Linda operated. She thrived on subtlety and plausible deniability, rarely resorting to outright meanness. Just sidelong glances, clipped corrections, opportunities accidentally missed. I started keeping a small notebook hidden inside an old copy of Online. I created a folder labeled Evidence. Every time Linda forwarded an email to Cole or Ashley, but not me, I took screenshots. When the school counselor praised Ashley for a project I had helped write while Linda pretended not to know, I recorded dates, conversations, and even the project drafts I'd saved to Google Docs before Ashley borrowed them. No more open vulnerabilities. It was harder than I thought to keep everything secret without losing my mind. There were times I wanted to scream, to confront Linda, and demand she see me. But I learned restraint the way a chess player learns to think 6 moves ahead. It became almost a game. Not about hurting them, but about waiting them out, letting them underestimate me. For example, I stopped leaving anything personal in common areas. My journal, if left unattended, would mysteriously be browsed for fun and result in me being teased for things I hadn't meant to share. Personal letters, club applications, even random notes. I kept everything private, using password protection and cloud backup anytime I could. I learned to use the school's printer instead of the home one, just in case Linda decided to accidentally misplace an important form. Every interaction became a lesson. If Linda made a dig disguised as advice, like, "College isn't for everyone, Jessica. Some girls do better in community programs," I'd write it down. This helped me see the bigger patterns. She praised her kids for ambition, but clipped mine in the bud, always with that affable smile. Watching Linda's patterns. With time, I became adept at predicting Linda's behavior. I saw how she manipulated my dad, waiting until he was tired or distracted to bring up new expenses or suggest family rules that somehow made things less fair for me. She'd schedule family events around Cole and Ashley's desires, always finding a reason I couldn't attend. When she gave me chores, it was always during the one after-school club meeting I cared about, or 5 minutes before I needed to log on for an online course. Linda was also skilled at creating evidence of her own. Whenever she was kind to me, she'd make sure it was public. A Facebook post about our wonderful stepdaughter, usually just before parent-teacher conferences, an Instagram photo of me at the dinner table, right before another batch of her cookies went to Ashley's bake sale. I kept records of these too, noting the stark differences between her online world and the reality I lived. But I never confronted her directly. I adopted her strategy of smiling when I had to, saying thank you for things that stung, and keeping every important thought locked behind my teeth. I used her underestimation to my advantage, making sure she never suspected how much I'd learned, gathering allies or not. There was a point where I considered telling a teacher or counselor. Some days, I even rehearsed what I'd say, trying on feeble versions of my story in my mind. But the possibility of not being believed, or worse, being told I was overreacting, terrified me. Linda's pristine public image was almost impossible to pierce. I realized early that I was better off gathering evidence and waiting for the right time, the right trigger, than risking my credibility in an offhand conversation with an adult who might side with the popular consensus. Even with friends, I was careful. I stopped inviting people over, tired of the looks from Cole and Ashley, the smirks that made my friends uncomfortable enough to stop coming. Instead, I shadowed everyone else, watching the families of others, messy, incomplete, but so much softer than mine, and thinking about the life they took for granted. Internal changes, the making of an outsider, detective. I poured my confusion and insight into creative outlets, turning my feelings into poems, short stories, and coded notes to myself. If my world wouldn't listen to me, maybe words on a page would. I read detective novels and psychology books, fascinated by how observation and analysis led characters from isolation to agency. If they could do it, maybe I could too. It became less about escape and more about understanding. I studied step-siblings in literature and TV shows. Sometimes villains, sometimes allies, always complicated. I read about power dynamics, about how women in history got what they wanted by being underestimated or playing by rules, only to turn them inside out. The more I saw myself in those stories, the clearer my role became. Not as a passive victim, but as an unseen operator, playing my own long game. I also reconsidered my relationship with my dad. I stopped expecting him to save me. Instead, I documented every conversation we had, with dates and context, especially those where he dismissed my concerns or deferred to Linda. The days when he softened toward me became precious, but I learned to keep my heart guarded. He might eventually be an ally, but only with the evidence I was gathering, monitoring Cole and Ashley. I didn't spare Cole and Ashley from my watchfulness either. Ashley, though usually cold, was more transparent. Her moods ebbed and flowed with her mom's. If she needed help with homework, she'd temporarily let me in, just long enough to gather what she needed. Cole was harder to read, sometimes sarcastic, sometimes just blank. I learned which friends of his were likely to repeat things back to Linda, and which ones seemed to dislike the family drama as much as I did. If Ashley borrowed my work or took credit for a project, I'd preemptively email drafts to teachers with a quick note, just a backup in case I lose my file, making sure there was a digital trail. If Cole teased me or tried to undercut me at school, I logged it, along with the reactions of those around us. Small slights accumulated into patterns, and those patterns, I knew, would eventually be impossible to ignore. Positioning for the future, all of this grew into more than just self-protection. It was about building toward an eventual confrontation, but one that would be on my terms. I researched my legal rights around scholarships and family savings accounts. I gathered screenshots of every bank notification that arrived in the family email, the ones I still had access to, and archived them off-site. I consulted school resources, never revealing too much, about how to apply for opportunities directly, selling myself as a highly motivated student rather than a stepdaughter in need. Slowly, I built a file large enough that, when the time came, I wouldn't just be another teenager complaining about unfairness. I would be a witness, armed with names, times, places, and facts that even Linda couldn't dismiss. If this sounds cold, it wasn't. Inside, I still ached for validation, for even a single moment of genuine kindness. But every time Linda reminded me how lucky I was, or Cole and Ashley froze me out of a conversation, my resolve grew deeper. I was crafting a kind of armor, one built from observation and patience. Lessons learned. Along the way through it all, I learned about control, not over other people, but over the only thing I could ever truly own, my own story. I set boundaries, even if only inside my head. I claimed simple spaces for myself: the library carol after class, the nature trail on Saturdays, the window alcove in my room, where I sketched or studied. There was peace in quiet defiance, and sometimes a brittle sense of power that reminded me I was still standing. I learned, too, that small victories could counterbalance 100 defeats. The day I found a scholarship on my own and applied before Linda could intercept it, the quiet satisfaction was like sipping hot tea after hours in the cold. Finding a hidden stash of birthday money and using it for a personal treat rather than handing it over for family bills felt like rebellion. I didn't stop hoping for change, but I stopped waiting for it to come from outside. Instead, I plotted my own course. I figured there must be an end to all of this, a moment when I'd have enough proof, enough leverage, or maybe just enough courage to make myself heard. Looking ahead, as winter faded into spring, my determination only sharpened. I knew I would need one last, perfect moment to bring everything to light, a time when my voice, backed by the weight of my careful records and all the subtle truths I'd gathered, would be impossible to ignore. Started to imagine it, the day I'd reveal everything, calmly and without apology, and watch as the house of cards Linda built finally began to collapse. Until then, I refined my plan inch by inch, never letting anyone, especially Linda, know how much I had learned to see. Each day, I reminded myself that silence can be a weapon, and that sometimes the quietest plans are the ones that change everything. The truth revealed. People think that when the truth finally comes out, it happens in a dramatic flash. Voices raised, secrets exposed, doors slammed. But for me, the moment when all my quiet work crested, it was nothing like that. There was no shouting, no thrown plates or sweeping declarations, just the heavy stillness of a house holding its breath. It started with a single email and ended with everything that had been hidden, finally dragged into the light. I'd spent months collecting evidence, screenshots of emails, photos of lopsided birthday gifts, bank notifications, a growing digital folder filled with notes about every toxic pattern and every lie. Each time Linda intercepted a scholarship application meant for me and slipped it to Ashley. Every time my dad brushed off my concerns and turned back to the safety of normalcy. Every moment when Linda's kindness flickered off as soon as the front door closed behind her friends. I recorded it all. I thought evidence would be my sword and shield. But when the day came, I realized truth is heavier than armor. The final piece. I didn't plan to have my breaking point the day I turned 17. If anything, I had hoped it might be a year when I could forget about family drama, when I could just celebrate being a year older and a little bit stronger. But as my birthday approached, my folder of proof had grown so heavy it felt like a secret weight pressing into my ribs every time I sat at the dinner table. I knew I was approaching a crossroads. It was time to decide. Would I continue to watch my own life slip past, or would I risk everything to be seen and heard, even if it meant burning the fragile piece that Linda so carefully curated? What pushed me over the edge was a single, careless mistake. Ashley had borrowed my favorite wool sweater, the one thing left of my mom's that still felt like home. She wore it to school, returned it stained with coffee, and when I confronted her, Linda brushed me off. Accidents happen. Don't be so dramatic. That night, sitting in the dim blue glow of my laptop, a sharp, electric anger set in. I scrolled through my folder, bank statements, denied club memberships, emails opened weeks too late. I saw not just a series of slights, but a pattern, a campaign of erasure that no longer felt accidental. I began drafting an email, Simple, direct. I attached my files, the evidence, the timelines, the screenshots. I addressed it to my dad. Just him, not Linda, not Cole or Ashley. I knew that if I included Linda, she would find a way to twist the narrative before it was even read. In the subject line, I just wrote, "Please read. The truth you haven't seen." The moment of release. I sat with my finger hovering above send. For what felt like hours, my heart pounded in my ears, my hands trembled as if I had something precious and breakable in my grip. I asked myself over and over, was I being vindictive? Was this the ultimate betrayal of my father's fragile new life? But every time I hesitated, I thought of all the times I'd swallowed my words, all the times I'd sat in my tiny lavender-scented room, listening to laughter drift through the walls. When I pressed send, it was silent. No great rush of relief, just a long, shuddering breath. For the first time in years, I felt the slightest shift of power. Mine, not borrowed or given, but claimed, waiting. The hours after sending that email were among the longest of my life. I sat in my room, knees pressed to my chest, watching shadows move across the wall as the sun angled through the window. Downstairs, life carried on. Linda humming in the kitchen, Cole grumbling about forgotten soccer cleats, the TV droning in the background. For the first time, I didn't care about missing out. I was no longer listening for an invitation. I checked my phone every few seconds. Nothing. No footsteps on the stairs, no knock on the door. I started to doubt myself. Would Dad read the email? Would he dismiss everything as adolescent melodrama? Would he even understand the coded language of my pain? The folder names, the screenshots, the lines in my journal that matched Ashley's plagiarized essay? Then, at twilight, there was the soft tap-tap at my door. My heart startled like a bird. I tucked my knees closer, as if making myself small might offer some protection. He stepped in. My father, David Miller, stoic and tired, eyes wary, as if already bracing for some storm. He held his phone in one hand, my own file of evidence open and glowing in the other. He didn't speak at first, just sat down at my desk, stared at the screen, then at me. In the silence, my stomach twisted. I couldn't read his face. Was it doubt, anger, shame? Finally, he said quietly, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Speaking the truth, aloud. It took all the courage I had to look him in the eye. I told him everything, not just the facts in the email, but the feelings beneath them. How I had watched pieces of my life siphoned away in silence. How every missed opportunity, every accident, felt like another reminder that I was secondary, expendable. How I'd learned to stop asking for kindness, brace against disappointment, hide the rawest parts of myself, even from him. At first he listened with a kind of frozen stillness, mouth pressed shut, the color draining from his cheeks. Then, as I described how Linda had rerouted my academic opportunities, how Cole and Ashley lived in privilege while I made do with hand-me-downs and empty praise, something broke in him. His face crumpled, not with tears, but with the hollow exhaustion of someone who sees, at last, all the consequences of their choices. He reached for my hand, a rare gesture these days. His voice wavered when he finally spoke. "I'm so sorry, Jess." For a long time, that's all he said. "I'm so sorry." Confrontation. What happened afterward could never be captured fully in words. My father demanded to see the financial files in person. He brought out old paperwork, receipts, questioned Linda at the dining table. Low and controlled at first, then teetering on the edge of anger as the facts piled up and Linda's careful veneer began to crack. There were excuses, of course. Linda wrapped herself in half-truths. I was only doing what was best for all the children. David, you said to handle it, so I did. But there was no denying the timeline. The evidence, the thousands of dollars stolen from my future and quietly deposited into Cole and Ashley's accounts, from scholarship forms redirected to Ashley's email, to club fees reimbursed for them, but not for me. Cole and Ashley sat in stunned silence, Cole's face contorted between indignant and ashamed, Ashley's cheeks mottled with confusion and something like guilt. For once, the roles were reversed. Linda explaining, dodging blame, my father silent and gray-faced, and I, finally, watching as the walls of Linda's false family fractured. Aftermath. It would be tempting to say everything was neatly resolved. Linda apologizing, my step-siblings suddenly kind, Dad cutting off the money and making it right. But real life is more complicated. There were angry words in the following days, slammed doors, even tears in the kitchen. When Linda realized her control was finally slipping, she insisted that she was misunderstood, claimed that blended families were impossible to balance. But she never apologized. Not to me. Cole and Ashley withdrew, sulking through dinners, avoiding me at school, blaming me for the tension. Linda alternated between icy distance and demonstrative public affection, as if one more photo on social media would glue the family back together. But even her friends began to notice the cracks. Dad was lost for a while. He spent nights poring over bills, sending apologetic emails to schools and scholarship offices, talking in low, ashamed tones to other parents whose children had unknowingly benefited from the deception. He promised to make things right, set up a new account I could access myself, and met with teachers and counselors to ensure I wouldn't be blocked from opportunities again. I moved through those days with a strange new calm. The wound was still there, raw and aching, but at least it was no longer invisible. No more silent martyrdom, no more doubts about whether any of it was real or just in my head. For the first time, my voice had changed something. The evidence I'd carried, like a stone, was now a shield, a signpost that said, I am here and I will not disappear. A new kind of family. In the weeks and months after, our family was never the same. Sometimes I missed the simplicity of anonymity, of hiding in my room, listening to laughter from behind closed doors, pretending I didn't care about belonging. But I had cracked the shell, and nothing would allow me back inside it. My father, to his immense credit, worked to rebuild what trust he could. He started asking again, not just, how was school, but real questions. How did that meeting go? Are you feeling overwhelmed? He drove me to campus interviews, asked for my input on big decisions, handed me the task of managing my own college savings. The loss couldn't be undone, but the path forward was finally mine to shape. As for Linda, life grew cooler, more distant. She resented the new boundaries, the daily reminders that she could not bend the world in her favor without consequence. Even Cole and Ashley, who had never truly welcomed me, stopped their passive slights. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps exhaustion, but the house grew quieter. For the first time, I found peace, not in being invisible, but in being acknowledged, however awkwardly. What the truth means. I didn't win a new family, but I gained something better, a blueprint for protecting myself. I learned the value of facts over pleading, the power of documentation, the dignity of refusing to let others write your story for you. I wasn't alone, not because my father swooped in to save me, but because I finally gave myself permission to be the author of my own fate. Truth, I discovered, is not about revenge or vindication. It's about visibility. It's the act of speaking out when you can't bear the silence any longer. My story no longer belonged to Linda's picture-perfect version, or even to my father's willful blindness. It belonged to me. And that, I realized, as spring bloomed outside my window, and I made plans for a future that truly felt like mine, was the greatest gift I could have given myself. Stepping out of the shadows. For so long, I thought the goal was survival, to make myself small enough to avoid notice, careful enough to avoid trouble, polite enough to pass through Linda's house like a shadow on the wall. After the truth came out, though, the silence inside me began to dissolve. I realized I needed, something more than simply not hurting. I wanted to begin living out loud, with all the risk and hope that might mean. What surprised me was that stepping out of the shadows wasn't about a single, triumphant moment, not the confrontation, not even the relief of finally being seen. It was a slow, stumbling journey, 1,000 quiet risks and choices, some so small they barely seemed to register. Other times, the steps were bigger, more demanding, full of the kind of uncertainty and vulnerability I used to avoid at any cost. Learning to stand in the light. In the first weeks after everything shifted, the house was quieter than ever. I could hear the ache in my father's voice when he tried, gently and clumsily, to rebuild a bridge with me. "Do you want to talk about college plans?" Or, "I saw an email about a scholarship you might like." His attempts were awkward, but real, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't turn away. The gaps between us were still there, but they were no longer filled with old resentments or misunderstandings. Sometimes we just sat together, sharing silence that wasn't heavy but companionable. Sometimes that was enough. With Linda, there was no healing, just an uneasy truce. We lived side by side, exchanging necessary words and nothing more. She stopped pretending, and so did I. The old rituals of forced politeness faded. The staged family photos, the saccharine praise in front of neighbors. I no longer hungered for her approval like I once did. I realized I'd wasted too much energy seeking affirmation from someone incapable of giving it. The space her withdrawal left behind became my own. I filled it with new interests, tentative friendships, and the first faint outlines of self-trust. I spent afternoons at the library, letting my curiosity roam free. I emailed teachers directly about summer programs and college essays. When I finally got a part-time job shelving books at a local bookstore, it felt like a small declaration of independence. My own earned money, my own schedule, my own pocket of the world where no one could revise the story I was building. Redrawing the map of belonging school for a while remained awkward. My step-siblings still held their circle of influence, but the social borders had shifted. Word got around that things at home weren't the picture of harmony Linda liked to present. I got some sidelong glances in hallways, some cautious questions from classmates who used to ignore me. At first, I hesitated to answer. Then I realized that honesty, without self-pity, without dramatics, could be liberating. "Things are complicated," I found myself saying. Or sometimes, with a hint of humor, "blended families are never like the movies." Some people lost interest. A few began to see me as more than just the stepdaughter. I joined the literary magazine, not because of anyone's encouragement, but because I realized how much I liked editing others' stories and writing my own. It was terrifying to submit something personal and know it might be rejected or ignored, but I forced myself to try anyway. Gradually, I built my own little tribe, not the instant, tight-knit group you see in movies, but a few people who seemed to genuinely care. There were study sessions at the coffee shop, long walks around the park, shared playlists, and swapped books. Sometimes I caught myself waiting for the brittle edge of envy or exclusion that had always come from home, but it didn't arrive. My friends didn't need me to be invisible or perfect. For the first time, my quirks and quietness were allowed, even appreciated. Letting go and moving on. The hardest part of all was learning to forgive myself for the years I'd spent silent. If I'm honest, there are still moments when the old shame creeps in, when I remember how desperately I longed to be included, how I let myself be minimized by Linda's rules and Cole and Ashley's indifference. But I tried to be kinder to the version of myself who did what she had to in order to get through the day. I started seeing a school counselor, not because my issues were solved, but because I owed it to myself to keep healing, to learn where the scars ended and the new growth might begin. Talking helped. It gave structure to the chaos in my head and words to feelings I'd only ever scribbled down in journals. I learned, little by little, that being resilient didn't mean pretending I wasn't ever broken. It meant letting new things grow in places that had once been barren. I also started reaching out to my mom more deliberately. Our relationship had always felt suspended in time, like a snow globe that only got shaken a couple weekends a month. After everything came out, I found the courage to be honest with her too. Not about every detail, but enough that I felt anchored again. She listened, really listened, in a way that soothed something old and aching in me. New dreams, new fears. With graduation inching closer, I allowed myself to dream bigger and with less fear. Applying to colleges wasn't just about escaping Linda's house, but about finding a place I could actually belong. I didn't know yet where I'd end up, but the process itself was empowering. Every application I filed, every essay I edited, reminded me that my future was finally in my hands. There were setbacks. Not every school wanted me. Not every scholarship came through. There were days I doubted whether any of it mattered, especially when Linda's bitterness bubbled over into new restrictions, or when Dad seemed lost in his own regrets. Cole and Ashley grew more distant, sometimes openly resentful, but I felt less threatened by that coldness now. I understood that it was a reflection of their own confusion and loyalties, not a measure of my worth. What helped most wasn't a single win or big breakthrough. It was the accumulation of small victories. The compliment from a teacher on my editing work. The first time I answered a question in class without rehearsing it 100 times in my head. Handing over my own paycheck at the bookstore for something I truly wanted but didn't need. Each act, no matter how quiet, felt like a thread woven into something durable and new. Finding my voice, the most profound shift, came from within. For so long, my default had been to keep quiet, to avoid making waves or being too much. But after the confrontation, with evidence of the injustice behind me and Dad's quiet support growing, realized I could speak up without the world shattering around me. I learned to say no, even to my father, when he lapsed into apologizing or tried to make up for lost time by smothering me with misguided affection. I told him gently what I did and didn't need. When teachers or counselors made assumptions about my family, I found ways to clarify and set boundaries. When Linda tried, occasionally, to reassert old patterns, "If you just tried harder, Jessica," I stood my ground, not with anger, but with calm, factual retorts that left her nowhere to go. Outside our house, I started to participate, even in spaces that felt intimidating. I read poetry at a school event, my voice shaky but proud. I volunteered at the library's children's reading hour, discovering the simple joy of helping little kids find their own stories. Sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with surprising ease. There was no single turning point, just a slow, upward climb, each step fueled by the knowledge that I no longer owed my silence to anyone. My value was not determined by Linda's approval or my siblings' acceptance. I had rebuilt myself from the scraps they could not erase. Looking toward tomorrow. Now, with childhood fading into memory and young adulthood unfurling ahead, I approach the world differently. I don't expect family to feel like safety, or home to be a place where hurt never finds me. I know now that belonging isn't given. It's chosen, built, nurtured, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, but always from the inside out. The future still scares me sometimes. College, new rooms to move through, new communities to navigate. But the fear is different now. It's not a fear of being erased, but of being seen and still risking disappointment. That's a risk I'm finally willing to take. I keep my old journal, the one filled with evidence, tucked away in the back of my closet. It's not for daily comfort, but for those rare moments when I question my own story. I flip through its pages and remember how far I've come. Not just how I was wounded, but how I learned to heal. And maybe, more than anything, that's what stepping out of the shadows has meant. Not just surviving my story, but writing it for myself. Not waiting for doors to open, but learning how to walk through them on my own. There's power in that, and peace too. A quiet, lasting strength that no one can take away from me again.